March 17, 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry, Tokyo. Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru set down the shipping loss report with hands that trembled despite decades of naval discipline. The document detailed February's merchant vessel casualties, 89 ships totaling 372,000 tons sent to the bottom of the Pacific. In a single month, the Americans had destroyed more tonnage than Japan could replace in 6 months. The mathematics were impossible, yet undeniable. Fukudome had spent 3 hours recalculating the figures, hoping to find an error that would make the nightmare less catastrophic. There was no error. Across his desk lay similar reports stretching back 18 months, each one worse than the last. January 1944, 312,000 tons lost. December 1943, 298,000 tons. The Americans were sinking Japanese shipping faster than the entire shipbuilding industry of the empire could construct replacements. More disturbing still, the rate was accelerating. The Vice Admiral walked to the wall map showing Japan's far-flung empire. Red pins marked the locations of recent sinkings. They clustered along every major sea route: the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, the waters around the Philippines, even the approaches to the home islands themselves. Nowhere was safe. The Americans had turned the Pacific Ocean into a graveyard for Japanese merchant shipping. What Fukudome couldn't know was that at that moment, 200 American submarines were hunting across the Pacific with radar, sophisticated torpedoes, and intelligence so precise they knew Japanese ship movements before Japanese captains did. Within 18 months, these submarines would sink 8 million tons of Japanese shipping, effectively severing every artery of Japan's island empire. The Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared for a decisive surface battle with the American fleet. Instead, they were losing the war beneath the waves, one merchant ship at a time, as their island garrisons slowly starved and their war machine ground to a halt for lack of fuel and raw materials. The starvation had already begun on distant islands where Japanese soldiers counted grains of rice and watched the horizon for supply ships that would never arrive. The submarine blockade that Japan never imagined possible was already irreversible. Every calculation the Imperial Navy had made about American capabilities was wrong. Every assumption about submarine warfare was obsolete. The Pacific War would be decided not by battleships dueling in daylight, but by submarines hunting in darkness, delivering economic strangulation to an empire that had fatally underestimated American industrial power and tactical innovation. The path to catastrophe began with miscalculation. In December 1941, as Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval staff conducted detailed analysis of American submarine potential. Their conclusions, based on European experience and traditional naval doctrine, proved fatally flawed. The report predicted American submarines would operate according to established international law, surfacing to warn merchant vessels before attack, allowing crews to abandon ship. This civilized warfare would give Japanese escorts time to respond, Japanese convoys opportunity to evade. The assessment continued with technological assumptions. American torpedoes, the report stated, were known to be unreliable based on pre-war intelligence. Japanese destroyer doctrine emphasized anti-surface warfare, not anti-submarine operations. The report concluded that submarine threat to Japanese merchant shipping would be manageable, perhaps 10 to 15% losses on major routes, troublesome but sustainable given Japan's planned conquests of resource-rich territories. Commander Omai Toshikazu, who helped prepare these assessments, would later testify to American interrogators about the fundamental error. We studied German U-boat operations against Britain and concluded submarines were effective only in coordinated wolf packs against slow convoys in confined waters like the Atlantic. The Pacific offered unlimited space for evasion. We calculated that even aggressive American submarine operations couldn't interdict our supply lines effectively. We were catastrophically wrong about everything. The Japanese Navy had prepared for the wrong war. Their destroyer force, among the world's finest for surface engagement with their deadly long-lance torpedoes, carried inadequate depth charges and primitive sonar. Their anti-submarine doctrine was virtually non-existent. Most critically, Japanese naval leadership viewed merchant shipping protection as unglamorous duty, assigning oldest destroyers and least experienced crews to convoy escort while their best ships prepared for the decisive battle that never came. Japan's island empire was a logistical nightmare waiting to happen. The conquests of 1941 and 1942 created a defensive perimeter spanning thousands of miles across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Maintaining this empire required constant shipping, oil from the Dutch East Indies to fuel the fleet and industry, rice from Indochina and Thailand to feed the population, rubber, tin, bauxite, iron ore from conquered territories, troops, ammunition, equipment to isolated garrisons on hundreds of islands. The empire's survival depended on sea lanes remaining open. Japanese planners calculated they needed 3 million tons of merchant shipping in constant operation to sustain military operations and minimum civilian needs. In December 1941, Japan possessed approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping, seemingly adequate for a war they expected to win quickly through decisive naval victory. The flaw in this calculation was assuming shipping would remain relatively secure. They had not accounted for American submarines that would hunt every ship, sink everything afloat, and turn maritime superiority into maritime catastrophe. American submarines in December 1941 were unprepared for the war they would win. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard weapon of the fleet, suffered from catastrophic defects that wouldn't be fully corrected until September 1943. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or not at all. Contact exploders failed on direct hits. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing beneath targets. Depth control mechanisms malfunctioned. American submarine captains in early 1942 experienced the frustration of perfect attack positions ruined by weapons that simply didn't work. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, who would become legendary as Wahoo's captain with 27 confirmed sinks, described his early patrols with bitter eloquence. "We'd stalk a target for hours, maneuver into perfect position, fire 4 torpedoes at a stopped tanker from 1,500 yards, and watch all 4 either explode prematurely or pass directly beneath without detonating. Then we'd dive deep while destroyers dropped depth charges overhead. We were risking our lives with defective weapons while the Navy Bureau of Ordnance insisted the torpedoes worked perfectly, and the problem was submarine captain incompetence." The torpedo scandal consumed 1942 and into 1943. Submarine captains reported failures in patrol report after patrol report. The Bureau of Ordnance, invested in defending their designs, blamed operator error. Finally, in June 1943, Admiral Ralph Christie conducted tests at Pearl Harbor using torpedoes fired at submerged nets. The torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than set. Further tests proved the magnetic exploders failed 60% of the time. The contact exploders crushed rather than detonating on direct perpendicular hits. By September 1943, American submarines went to sea with corrected torpedoes, reliable depth control, exploders that functioned, and 2 years of hard-earned tactical experience. The slaughter of Japanese merchant shipping was about to begin in earnest. But even with defective torpedoes in 1942, American submarines had sunk approximately 180 Japanese ships, totaling over 700,000 tons. The Japanese merchant fleet was already bleeding before American weapons began working properly. The transformation began with industrial might Japan couldn't match. The United States entered the war with roughly 100 submarines in the Pacific. American shipyards, applying mass production techniques to submarine construction, would deliver over 200 fleet submarines during the war years. Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California led production, completing submarines in 9 to 12 months, from keel laying to commissioning, a pace Japanese yards couldn't approach. The American fleet submarine, primarily Gato and Balao class boats, represented technological sophistication disguised as industrial product. Each submarine displaced 1,500 tons surfaced, carried 24 torpedoes, mounted one 5-inch deck gun plus anti-aircraft weapons, possessed radar systems that allowed surface attacks at night, contained air conditioning that enabled operations in tropical waters, featured advanced fire control computers, and could dive to 300 feet or more deeper than Japanese depth charges were set to explode. More importantly, American submarines operated with advantages invisible to Japanese defenders. Ultra-intelligence, the breaking of Japanese naval codes, provided submarine commanders with precise information about convoy routes, schedules, and composition. American submarines often knew where Japanese ships would be before the ship's captains did. This intelligence advantage, combined with radar that detected surface vessels beyond visual range, transformed submarine operations from hunt and hope into precisely planned ambushes. The submarine that would come to symbolize American undersea warfare prowess, USS Wahoo under Dudley Morton, conducted its third war patrol in January 1943. Morton revolutionized submarine tactics by refusing to follow the cautious doctrine of attacking submerged from periscope depth. Instead, Wahoo attacked on the surface at night, using speed and radar advantage, closing to point-blank range where even defective torpedoes couldn't miss, and pressing attacks aggressively regardless of escorts. On January 24, 1943, in the Palau-Wewak shipping lane, Wahoo encountered a Japanese convoy of 2 freighters escorted by a destroyer. Morton attacked on the surface in daylight, a tactic considered suicidal. Using Wahoo's superior speed to maneuver, Morton evaded the destroyer, sank both freighters, then turned and sank the destroyer itself with 3 perfectly aimed torpedoes from less than 800 yards. The action lasted 7 hours. Morton expended 13 torpedoes and destroyed approximately 15,000 tons of shipping, plus a valuable warship. More significantly, he demonstrated that aggressive surface tactics could overwhelm Japanese escorts and convoy defenses. Morton's patrol reports, written with flair unusual for military documents, circulated through the submarine force. His tactics, initially controversial, proved brutally effective. Wahoo's 4th patrol in March 1943 destroyed 9 ships totaling 21,000 tons in the Yellow Sea, basically Japan's home waters. Morton attacked convoys repeatedly, reloaded torpedoes under depth charge attack, surfaced among sinking ships to machine gun survivors in lifeboats, an action that violated maritime convention but reflected the total war the Pacific had become. The Japanese merchant marine began experiencing terror at night. Radar-equipped American submarines appeared from darkness at close range. Torpedoes arrived without warning. Escorts attempting to respond found their targets had vanished into blackness. Morning revealed burning ships and oil-covered survivors. The Imperial Navy's assumption that Pacific distances would limit submarine effectiveness was proving catastrophically wrong. American submarines were everywhere, striking without warning, disappearing without trace. By mid-1943, Japanese shipping losses exceeded replacement capacity. In the first half of the year, submarines sank approximately 600,000 tons of merchant shipping. Japanese yards completed perhaps 250,000 tons of new construction. The gap was widening month by month. Vice Admiral Fukudome's staff calculated that at current rates, Japan would lose its entire merchant fleet within 2 years. The calculation assumed losses remained constant. Instead, they were accelerating as American submarines multiplied and their tactics improved. The human cost of submarine warfare fell heavily on Japanese merchant sailors. Casualties among merchant marine personnel eventually exceeded 70%. Higher than any other Japanese military service. Ships went down in minutes after torpedo hits. Survivors faced days or weeks in lifeboats in the vast Pacific. Many were never found. The merchant marine that began the war with confidence and patriotic fervor became increasingly reluctant. By 1944, Merchant sailors were being conscripted and threatened with execution for refusing dangerous duty. Ships sailed with minimal crews who knew each voyage might be their last. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding destroyer Shigure through numerous convoy escort missions, documented the mounting catastrophe in his memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain. In 1942, we occasionally encountered American submarines. By mid-1943, every convoy operation involved submarine contact. By 1944, it was unusual when we didn't lose ships. The Americans seemed to know our routes, our schedules, even our evasive maneuvers. They waited in positions we hadn't reached yet. Our detection equipment was primitive, our depth charges inadequate, our tactics obsolete. We sailed into ambushes we couldn't prevent. The mathematics of attrition were merciless. An American submarine carried 24 torpedoes. A typical successful patrol expended 16 to 20 torpedoes, sinking 4 to 6 ships. The submarine returned to Pearl Harbor or Australia, received new torpedoes, underwent quick maintenance and deployed again within 3 weeks. Japanese shipyards couldn't replace 4 to 6 merchant ships in the time it took one American submarine to rearm and return to sea. With 200 American submarines eventually operating, the multiplication was overwhelming. Japanese strategic planning had failed to account for American advantages that multiplied submarine effectiveness. Forward bases at Pearl Harbor, Midway, and eventually Guam reduced transit time and extended patrol periods. Sophisticated logistics provided spare parts, torpedoes, and supplies, allowing submarines to remain operational. Advanced training kept crews proficient. Most critically, the Americans rotated crews while the submarine remained in theater, maintaining operational tempo Japanese submarines couldn't match. The greatest force multiplier was intelligence. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii read Japanese merchant shipping codes, naval movement orders, and convoy schedules. This information reached submarine commanders via encrypted messages, positioning submarines along convoy routes days before the ships arrived. The intelligence advantage was so complete that some Japanese naval officers suspected traitors were providing convoy information to the Americans. They never imagined their codes had been broken so thoroughly that Americans read their orders before subordinate commanders did. USS Flasher exemplifies how intelligence and technology combined for devastating effect. On its third war patrol in December 1944, under Commander Reuben Whitaker, Flasher received ultra-intelligence about a Japanese convoy transporting aviation fuel from Singapore to Manila. The information specified the convoy's composition, 4 tankers plus escorts, the exact route, and the schedule. Flasher positioned itself along the projected path and waited. On December 4, 1944, the convoy appeared precisely where and when predicted. Flasher attacked at night on the surface, sinking 2 tankers totaling 22,000 tons, both loaded with aviation fuel desperately needed by Japanese air forces in the Philippines. Flasher evaded escorts, repositioned, and attacked again the next night, sinking the remaining 2 tankers. In 2 nights, 1 American submarine destroyed 4 critical tankers, depriving Japanese air forces of fuel that might have affected the Philippine campaign. The patrol demonstrated perfect integration of intelligence, technology, and aggressive tactics. By late 1944, Japanese merchant shipping operated under conditions approaching the impossible. Convoys hugged coastlines where shallow water limited submarine operations, adding hundreds of miles to voyages. Ships sailed only at night when possible, though radar-equipped American submarines hunted as effectively in darkness. Some desperate merchant captains ran without lights, causing collisions that sank ships more efficiently than torpedoes. Others ignored convoy discipline entirely, scattering when attacked rather than maintaining formation, making themselves easier individual targets. The convoy system that should have protected merchant shipping proved inadequate. Japan began the war with insufficient escorts, diverted most to fleet operations rather than convoy duty, and never built enough replacements. By 1944, the typical Japanese convoy had 1 or 2 escorts for 6 to 8 merchant ships, inadequate protection against multiple submarine attacks. American submarines developed pack tactics, multiple boats coordinating attacks from different bearings simultaneously, overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers. Commander Samuel Dealey in USS Harder pioneered aggressive anti-escort tactics that reversed the submarine-destroyer relationship. Rather than evading Japanese destroyers, Dealey hunted them deliberately. On a single patrol in June 1944, Harder sank 5 Japanese destroyers in 6 days, using point-blank attacks that gave destroyers no time to respond. Each destroyer represented hundreds of skilled sailors and a warship Japan couldn't replace. The loss of 5 destroyers in a week to a single submarine demonstrated how completely the balance of undersea warfare had shifted. The strategic impact extended beyond tonnage statistics. Oil tankers from the Dutch East Indies became primary targets. American submarines sank tankers with special enthusiasm, knowing each one denied Japan the fuel essential for fleet operations and industry. By late 1944, fuel shortages forced the combined fleet to split, sending major warships to Southeast Asia to be near fuel sources. This dispersion contributed to the lopsided American victory at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where Japanese forces couldn't concentrate properly because they lacked fuel for coordinated operations. Food shipments from Southeast Asia became equally critical targets. Rice from Indochina, Thailand, and Burma fed not just the Japanese military, but the home population. American submarines targeted these shipments ruthlessly. By 1945, Japan faced genuine starvation, with urban populations on survival rations. The blockade Americans imposed through submarine warfare was strangling Japan economically, militarily, and nutritionally simultaneously. The human tragedy playing out on isolated island garrisons revealed the blockade's full horror. Japanese forces occupied hundreds of islands across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Maintaining these garrisons required constant shipping of food, medicine, ammunition, and equipment. As American submarines severed supply lines, island garrisons began starving in slow motion, cut off from relief, watching empty horizons, and dying not from American attacks, but from malnutrition and disease. Rabaul, once Japan's major base in the South Pacific, housed over 100,000 Japanese military personnel at its peak. By 1944, American submarines made supply runs so dangerous that few ships attempted the journey. The garrison was supposed to be relieved. Instead, it was left to starve. Soldiers cultivated every available square foot of ground, fished continuously, and still faced malnutrition. By war's end, the Rabaul garrison had been neutralized not through invasion but through isolation, rendered combat ineffective by hunger. Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, experienced similar fate. After the devastating American carrier raid in February 1944, submarines ensured no meaningful supplies reached the base. The garrison slowly withered, unable to defend effectively or to evacuate, trapped by the same ocean that once represented Japanese dominance. When American forces finally accepted surrender in 1945, they found skeletal survivors who had endured 18 months of slow starvation, maintaining military discipline while their bodies consumed themselves. The Philippines campaign demonstrated submarine warfare's strategic value. As American forces prepared for invasion in October 1944, submarines intensified operations against Japanese shipping in the South China Sea and Philippine waters. In September and October 1944, submarines sank over 100 Japanese ships, effectively isolating Japanese forces in the Philippines from reinforcement and resupply. General Yamashita Tomoyuki's defensive operations were crippled by lack of supplies submarines prevented from arriving. The submarine blockade affected Japanese war production directly. Factories in Japan required constant raw material imports. Iron ore, bauxite, rubber, tin, petroleum all came from conquered territories across the sea. As submarines sank cargo ships carrying these materials, Japanese industry starved for resources. Aircraft production declined not from bombing but from lack of aluminum. Tank production stopped for want of steel. The submarine offensive was an economic blockade that severed the empire's industrial lifelines. By January 1945, Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru stood again before the wall map, adding fresh red pins for December's losses. 437,000 tons sunk in a single month. The map was now solid red. Every sea lane, every convoy route, every approach to the home islands bore clusters of pins marking where ships died and sailors drowned. The mathematics had become terminal. Japan's remaining merchant fleet totaled perhaps 2 million tons, barely enough for minimal food imports, completely inadequate for military operations. Fukudome drafted his assessment for the Naval General Staff. The report concluded with unusual directness for a Japanese military document. The submarine blockade has succeeded. Our merchant fleet is destroyed beyond recovery. Raw material imports have ceased. Food imports are inadequate to prevent civilian starvation. Military operations requiring sea transport are no longer feasible. The empire is being strangled. This situation is irreversible with available resources. The report was filed, read, and ignored by leadership that still hoped for negotiated peace following one final decisive victory that logistics no longer permitted. The Americans at this point had submarine operations refined to industrial process. Advanced training at Submarine School in New London, Connecticut, produced crews ready for immediate combat. Torpedo factories operated at full capacity, producing weapons that now worked properly and deadly. Forward bases provided maintenance and supplies, allowing submarines to spend maximum time on patrol. Intelligence services fed precise targeting information. New construction replaced combat losses and expanded the force continuously. The submarine offensive had achieved overwhelming momentum. Nothing Japan could do would slow. Individual submarine success stories illustrated the cumulative catastrophe. USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, conducted 5 war patrols before being lost in October 1944. In those 5 patrols, Tang sank 24 confirmed Japanese ships totaling 93,000 tons, becoming the most successful American submarine by tonnage. O'Kane's aggressive tactics, attacking multiple ships in single engagements, pressing attacks until all torpedoes were expended, epitomized the relentless pressure Japanese shipping faced. Tang's final patrol demonstrated both the deadliness and danger of submarine operations. In the Taiwan Strait on October 10th and 11th, 1944, Tang attacked a large convoy, sinking 7 ships in a continuous battle that lasted 2 nights. On October 24th, attacking another convoy, Tang's last torpedo malfunctioned, circled back, and struck Tang itself. The submarine sank in seconds. Of 87 crew members, only 9 survived, including O'Kane. Even in death, Tang's patrol had destroyed 13 ships, a devastating blow to Japanese logistics. The price of American submarine warfare, while significant, remained sustainable. 52 American submarines were lost during the Pacific War, taking 3,500 submariners to the bottom. These losses, tragic for the families and crews involved, represented roughly 25% of the submarine force and 3% of the men who served. In exchange, American submarines sank approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, plus over 200 naval vessels. The exchange ratio was over 20-to-1 in ships, vastly higher in tonnage and strategic value. Japanese countermeasures proved consistently inadequate. Escort vessels lacked radar, making night detection nearly impossible. Sonar equipment was primitive, with short detection range and poor resolution. Depth charges typically set for shallow explosions couldn't reach American submarines diving to 300 feet or more. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine emphasized aggressive surface pursuit, which played into American advantages in speed and maneuverability. The few times Japanese forces achieved success came through luck rather than systematic capability. The most successful Japanese anti-submarine effort came not from escorts but from aircraft. Land-based patrol planes occasionally caught submarines on the surface, transiting to patrol areas. Several submarines were lost to air attack, including WWII in October 1943, caught on the surface in the La Perouse Strait by Japanese aircraft. But Japan couldn't dedicate sufficient aircraft to anti-submarine warfare. Most went to defending against American bombing or supporting ground operations, leaving convoy routes inadequately covered. Desperation drove Japanese shipping to extreme measures by 1945. Some cargo was divided among small sailing vessels, too insignificant for submarines to waste torpedoes on, though even these occasionally fell victim to deck gunfire. Submarines were occasionally used for cargo transport, an inefficient use of expensive warships, but necessary when surface ships couldn't survive. One bizarre plan called for converting high-speed destroyers to cargo carriers, stripping weapons to maximize cargo space. The plan failed because fuel shortages prevented high-speed destroyer operations anyway. The island garrisons, abandoned to starvation, experienced conditions that revealed the blockade's human cost beyond statistics. On Bougainville, 23,000 Japanese troops became increasingly isolated as American submarines made resupply impossible. Ordered to grow their own food, they cleared jungle and planted gardens. Malaria, malnutrition, and disease killed more men than American attacks. When the garrison finally surrendered in August 1945, survivors were skeletal, many too weak to walk. Wake Island's garrison of over 4,000 troops faced similar isolation. After the initial Japanese conquest in December 1941, the island became a forward base, requiring constant supply. As submarine warfare intensified, supply ships stopped coming. The garrison consumed stockpiled food, then began starving. On October 7, 1943, believing American invasion imminent due to submarine activity offshore, the garrison commander ordered the execution of 98 American civilian workers still on the island. The massacre, one of many war crimes born partly from isolation and desperation, was followed by 16 more months of garrison existence without adequate supplies. Waiwak in New Guinea housed 55,000 Japanese troops who watched shipping lanes but never saw supply ships. American submarines and aircraft made the area a death zone for Japanese shipping. The garrison survived on local resources, fishing, and agriculture, but lacked medicine, ammunition, and basic supplies. Diseases spread. Malaria became epidemic. When Australian forces accepted their surrender in September 1945, they found a garrison that had been combat ineffective for over a year, not from enemy action but from isolation and starvation. The mathematics of starvation were precise and cruel. An adult male requires approximately 2,200 calories daily to maintain body weight and function. Japanese military rations provided 3,000 calories daily when available, accounting for physical demands of military service. As supplies failed, rations dropped to 2,000 calories, then 1,500, then 1,000. Below 1,200 calories daily, the body begins consuming its own muscle and organs. At 800 calories, physical activity becomes minimal. Below that, death approaches within weeks. Garrison medical records recovered after the war documented this descent. On islands where resupply failed completely, death rates from starvation and related diseases reached 5 to 10% monthly by early 1945. Some garrisons lost more men to hunger than to enemy action during the entire war. The submarine blockade killed Japanese soldiers who never saw an American, who died watching empty horizons, bodies slowly consuming themselves because ships couldn't reach them. The psychological impact on these isolated garrisons was documented in diaries and letters recovered post-war. Soldiers wrote of daily routines revolving around inadequate food, of dreams about meals from home, of watching comrades weaken and die. They expressed bewilderment at being forgotten, anger at commanders who ordered them to hold positions that had become strategically meaningless, and despair at the realization that relief would never come. Many final diary entries referenced submarines that had severed their connection to the homeland. One particularly poignant account came from a lieutenant on New Britain who kept detailed records until June 1945. His diary described the progression from confident garrison expecting relief to desperate men eating grass and insects. The final entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, detailed hallucinations of supply ships appearing on the horizon. The diary ended with a note dated June 18th, stating simply that submarine blockade had succeeded, that no help would come, and that he hoped someone would someday understand what they had endured. Australian forces found his body and the diary in September. The submarine blockade affected Japanese morale even in areas still receiving supplies. Merchant sailors faced mortality rates exceeding 70%, higher than any other service. Many refused to sail. Some committed suicide rather than board ships. The military had to conscript merchant crews and threaten execution for desertion. Ships sailed with skeleton crews of terrified men who knew they likely wouldn't survive the voyage. This terror was itself a victory for American submarines, rendering the merchant marine increasingly ineffective even when ships remained available. On the home island, civilian population experienced the blockade through hunger that increased throughout 1945. Rice rations dropped below subsistence levels. Cities implemented rationing of 750 grams of rice per person per week, barely enough to survive. Black markets flourished as people traded possessions for food. Malnutrition became widespread, particularly affecting children and elderly. The submarine blockade was starving Japan's population, creating conditions that foreshadowed surrender even before atomic bombs fell. Industrial collapse followed close behind food shortages. By March 1945, Japanese factories operated at 25% capacity, not primarily from American bombing, but from lack of raw materials submarines prevented from arriving. 90% steel production dropped for want of iron ore and coal from Manchuria and Southeast Asia. Aircraft production declined, not from factory damage, but from lack of aluminum. Chemical plants stopped producing explosives for lack of imported materials. The submarine blockade was destroying Japan's ability to continue war through economic strangulation. The oil situation became terminal. Japan's entire war strategy had been predicated on seizing Dutch East Indies oil fields. By 1945, those fields remained in Japanese hands, but might as well have been on the moon. Submarines made tanker traffic nearly impossible. Japan's oil reserves dropped to the hundreds of thousands of barrels, barely weeks of minimal operation. The combined fleet stayed in port not just to preserve ships, but because fuel didn't exist for operations. Aircraft couldn't train for lack of fuel. The empire that had gone to war for oil was being defeated by its inability to transport that oil. Vice Admiral Fukudome's successor, tasked with shipping coordination in the war's final months, faced impossible mathematics. Japanese shipyards were completing perhaps 20,000 tons monthly of new merchant construction, down from 100,000 tons earlier in the war, due to material shortages and bombing. American submarines were sinking 200,000 tons monthly. The deficit was unbridgeable. Staff officers calculated that even if submarine sinkings stopped completely, which they wouldn't, Japan lacked sufficient ships for minimal imports. The merchant marine was extinct as a functioning fleet. The final statistics of submarine warfare in the Pacific remain staggering 7 decades later. American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5,323,000 tons, plus 214 naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 carriers, and 11 cruisers. Japanese merchant marine casualties exceeded 70%. Approximately 116,000 merchant sailors died, higher percentage losses than any combatant service. The 8 million ton figure referenced in strategic assessments included ships destroyed by all causes, including submarines, aircraft, and mines, but submarines accounted for nearly 2/3 of total merchant shipping losses. These numbers, abstract on paper, represented human tragedy multiplied across thousands of individual ship sinkings. Each statistic was a ship full of men who drowned, burned, or died from exposure in lifeboats. Each merchant ship sinking averaged 50 to 100 casualties. The approximately 1,300 ships sunk represented over 100,000 individual deaths, men who perished not in combat, but in economic warfare conducted beneath the waves. For Japanese soldiers on isolated islands, the statistics meant slow death by starvation. Approximately 250,000 Japanese military personnel died on bypassed islands, most from malnutrition and disease rather than combat. These men were killed by American submarines as surely as if they had been torpedoed directly, dying slowly because ships couldn't reach them with food and medicine. The submarine blockade's human cost extended far beyond the sailors who went down with torpedoed ships. American submarine commanders rarely saw the full consequences of their success. They attacked ships, watched them sink, and moved to the next target. They didn't witness the island garrisons that starved because their supply ships never arrived. They didn't see Japanese children weakening from malnutrition because rice ships were on the ocean floor. They fought a clean war from their perspective, attacking military and economic targets, unaware of the cascading humanitarian catastrophe their success created. Some submariners struggled with what they called the tanker problem. Torpedoing a warship was clearly legitimate warfare. Sinking a loaded troop transport prevented enemy soldiers from reinforcing threatened areas. But tankers and cargo ships carried civilian crews who had no choice about their service. Some submarine commanders reported difficulty ordering attacks on obviously civilian vessels. The Navy's response was pragmatic. In total war, there were no civilian targets. Every ship served Japan's war effort and was therefore legitimate prey. The deadliest single submarine attack illustrated this moral complexity. On June 29, 1944, USS Sturgeon, commanded by Commander Connie Murphy, attacked the freighter Toyama Maru in the East China Sea. The ship, marked as a cargo vessel, was actually transporting 7,000 Allied prisoners of war from Singapore to Japan. Sturgeon's torpedoes struck home. The ship sank rapidly. Approximately 5,600 prisoners drowned or were killed in the explosion, one of the worst maritime disasters of the war. Murphy had no way of knowing his target carried Allied POWs. Japan had violated international law by not marking the ship as carrying prisoners. The tragedy exemplified the blind nature of submarine warfare. American submarines lost throughout the war represented their own human tragedies. 52 submarines failed to return from patrol, taking 3,500 submariners down with them. Most disappeared without survivors, leaving families with only missing in action notifications and decades of wondering what happened. Some sinkings were reconstructed from Japanese records after the war. Others remain mysteries, boats that vanished in the vast Pacific with no explanation beyond presumed lost. USS Wahoo's fate remained unknown until Japanese records revealed she had been sunk by aircraft in La Perouse Strait in October 1943. USS Trigger disappeared in March 1945, likely sunk by Japanese escorts, with no survivors. USS Tang's sinking by her own torpedo at least left survivors to tell the story. For most boats, families never knew whether their sailors died instantly from torpedo explosion, drowned as compartments flooded, or survived hours in sunken submarines waiting for air to expire. The ocean kept its secrets. Yet the exchange ratio remained overwhelmingly in America's favor. 52 submarines lost versus 1,300 Japanese merchant ships sunk. 3,500 American submariners lost versus 116,000 Japanese merchant sailors killed. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. American submarine warfare achieved strategic victory at costs Japan could never inflict, could never sustain, could never overcome. The intelligence advantage remained Japan's unknown fatal weakness throughout the war. Japanese naval codes, broken by American cryptanalysts before Pearl Harbor, remained compromised until war's end, despite periodic changes. Every major Japanese naval operation, every convoy schedule, every ship movement was read by American intelligence and transmitted to submarines. This advantage multiplied submarine effectiveness beyond what technology alone could achieve. Commander Samuel Dealey in USS Harder, before his final patrol in which the boat was lost, described using ultra-intelligence to intercept a Japanese convoy. The information specified convoy composition, route, speed, even the moon phase. Harder positioned itself exactly along the projected path. The convoy appeared precisely on schedule where predicted. Dealey commented that with such intelligence, submarine warfare became almost unfair. The Japanese didn't realize they were fighting blind against an enemy who read all their signals, knew all their plans, saw all their moves before they made them. Post-war interrogations of Japanese naval officers revealed they had never suspected their codes were comprehensively broken. They attributed American submarine effectiveness to radar, aggressive tactics, better torpedoes, and overwhelming numbers. Some suspected traitors were passing convoy information. The possibility that Americans routinely read their most secret communications never occurred to them. This intelligence blindness persisted until the end, giving American submarines an insuperable advantage throughout the conflict. The submarine force that began the war unprepared, with defective weapons and cautious doctrine, evolved into the most deadly naval force in the Pacific. By 1945, American submarines operated with near impunity. Japanese anti-submarine capability had eroded to ineffectiveness. New fleet submarines were being completed monthly to replace losses and expand the force. Improved torpedoes boasted 97% reliability. Aggressive tactics were doctrine rather than exception. The submarine force had become an unstoppable weapon of economic warfare. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines Pacific Fleet from February 1943, watched the transformation with satisfaction. His post-war report summarized the achievement clinically. The submarine force, comprising less than 2% of total naval personnel, accounted for 55% of all Japanese shipping losses. This represented the most efficient use of military resources in the Pacific theater. Strategic impact exceeded any other single weapon system. The submarine blockade rendered Japanese continuation of the war economically impossible by mid-1945. Japanese naval leadership, reflecting on their defeat, consistently identified submarine warfare as more decisive than they had anticipated. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, Navy Minister for much of the war, testified that inadequate preparation for anti-submarine warfare and insufficient merchant marine protection were among Japan's greatest strategic errors. We prepared to fight the American fleet in decisive battle. We lost to American submarines we barely saw, destroying shipping we never adequately protected. By the time we recognized the threat, our merchant marine was already destroyed beyond recovery. Admiral Toyoda Suemu, last wartime commander of the combined fleet, was more direct in his assessment. The Americans strangled us. They didn't need to invade the home islands. The submarine blockade made continued resistance impossible. We couldn't feed our people, fuel our aircraft, supply our armies, or maintain industrial production. The war was lost economically before it ended militarily. American submarines achieved what the entire Imperial Navy couldn't prevent. The contrast between Japanese submarine operations and American success revealed doctrinal failures beyond technology. Japan began the war with approximately 70 submarines, many technically sophisticated. But Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized attacking enemy warships rather than merchant shipping. They viewed submarines as adjuncts to fleet operations, not independent strategic weapons. This doctrine wasted their submarine force on heavily defended targets, while American merchants sailed relatively unmolested. Japanese submarines scored some notable successes against American warships, sinking carrier Wasp and damaging carrier Saratoga, among others. But these tactical victories didn't affect American strategic capability. Meanwhile, American submarines destroying Japanese merchant shipping throttled Japan's war economy. The doctrinal difference was fatal. Japan used submarines for tactical warfare, while America waged strategic economic warfare beneath the waves. The human stories emerging from both sides added texture to bare statistics. Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb conducted aggressive patrols that included surfacing to shell shore installations with his deck gun, landing saboteurs on Japanese-held coastlines, even attacking ships in harbors. His patrol reports read like adventure novels, but each success represented Japanese sailors dying, cargo lost, war material that never reached its destination. Fluckey earned the Medal of Honor and survived the war, but his successes contributed to the starvation and economic collapse that killed hundreds of thousands. On the Japanese side, merchant captain testimonies revealed the terror of sailing through submarine-infested waters. Captain Hiroshi Nakajima, who survived 4 ship sinkings, described convoy operations as sailing through a maze of invisible death. We never saw the submarines. The first indication of attack was torpedo explosion. Within minutes, the ship was sinking. Lifeboats were often lost in the explosion. Swimming in the Pacific with no land in sight, you knew rescue was unlikely. I survived because I was lucky 4 times. Most sailors weren't lucky once. The transformation of American torpedo technology from liability to deadly weapon represented engineering persistence that Japanese industry couldn't match. By late 1943, the Mark 14 torpedo ran true at set depth, exploded reliably, achieved 80% hit rate, and detonated with devastating effect. American submarines also employed Mark 18 electric torpedoes that left no wake, approaching targets invisibly. Japanese countermeasures against wake-following torpedoes became useless against wakeless weapons. Technology, doctrine, and tactics combined to create overwhelming advantages. American submarine construction represented industrial achievement Japan couldn't approach. Electric Boat and Mare Island together produced over 100 Gato and Balao class submarines between 1941 and 1945. These boats, built to standardized designs allowing mass production, incorporated lessons from combat in real time. Early boats underwent modifications during construction based on patrol reports from deployed submarines. This feedback loop created continuous improvement impossible in Japanese shipyards operating under resource constraints and bombing. The economic calculation that doomed Japan became inescapable by early 1945. American submarines operating from forward bases could remain on patrol for 60 days. With 200 submarines deployed, approximately 150 were on patrol at any time, blanketing every sea lane. Japanese merchant traffic attempted to move approximately 200,000 tons monthly by early 1945. American submarines were destroying 100,000 tons monthly. The deficit meant the merchant marine was disappearing, taking with it any hope of sustaining the war effort. Food shortages in Japan reached crisis levels in spring 1945. Urban populations received rations of 750 to 1,000 calories daily, barely sufficient to sustain life without physical labor. Factory workers, weakened from malnutrition, couldn't maintain production. School children showed signs of protein deficiency and vitamin deficiencies. Black market prices soared beyond reach of ordinary families. The submarine blockade was starving Japan's population toward surrender. Military consequences followed economic collapse. The Navy couldn't sortie for lack of fuel. Training ceased because fuel couldn't be wasted on instruction. Pilots entered combat with minimal flight hours. Kamikaze tactics, while ideologically driven, also reflected fuel conservation since one-way missions required less fuel than conventional operations. The submarine blockade was degrading Japanese military capability through resource starvation more effectively than American bombing or surface attacks. The final months of the war saw submarine operations become almost routine slaughter. Japanese shipping moved in small groups hugging coastlines, avoiding open ocean where submarines dominated. These tactics added days to voyages, consumed scarce fuel, and still resulted in heavy losses. Some Japanese ships sailed without escorts because none existed. Submarines encountered undefended merchant ships and sank them with single torpedoes, not bothering to waste additional weapons on targets already doomed. USS Archerfish conducted a patrol in November 1944 that symbolized both American success and Japanese desperation. On November 29th, Archerfish encountered the newly completed carrier Shinano, largest carrier in the world at 72,000 tons, on her maiden voyage from Tokyo Bay to Kure. Shinano, theoretically unsinkable with her battleship-grade armor, carried inadequate damage control personnel because trained crews couldn't be spared. Archerfish fired 6 torpedoes, 4 hit. Shinano's crew, inexperienced and poorly trained due to the personnel crisis, couldn't contain flooding. The great carrier, which represented Japan's hope for naval revival, sank 7 hours later. One submarine with 6 torpedoes destroyed Japan's largest warship through the cascading failures submarine warfare had created. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands, while devastating, was enabled by submarine warfare that strangled Japan's economy beforehand. Bombers destroyed factories that couldn't operate anyway for lack of raw materials submarines had prevented from arriving. Fire raids burned cities whose populations were already starving from food supplies submarines had interdicted. The submarine blockade made Japan vulnerable to air attack by destroying the economic foundation of resistance. When atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japanese surrender, the submarine blockade had already rendered continued resistance economically impossible. Japan couldn't feed its people, fuel its military, or sustain industrial production. The atomic bombs ended the war that submarines had already won economically. Some historians argue Japan would have surrendered by November 1945 from blockade effects alone, though at costs of hundreds of thousands of additional lives lost to starvation and conventional bombing. The final accounting of Japan's merchant marine revealed the completeness of its destruction. Of 6 million tons available in December 1941, approximately 300,000 tons remained operational in August 1945. The rest was on the ocean floor, sunk by submarines, aircraft, mines, or simply abandoned without fuel or crews. The merchant marine that had enabled Japan's imperial expansion was extinct, and with it died Japan's ability to remain a maritime empire. Post-war analysis by Japanese economists calculated that submarine warfare cost Japan more than all other forms of warfare combined. The 8 million tons of shipping lost represented not just the ships, but their cargoes, the raw materials never delivered, the food that never arrived, the fuel that never reached its destination. Each ton of shipping represented perhaps 10 tons of cargo over its operational lifetime. The 8 million tons lost represented 80 million tons of cargo that never sustained Japan's war effort or fed its people. Admiral Nimitz, in his post-war assessment, credited submarine warfare with decisive impact disproportionate to resources committed. The submarine force, he noted, comprised less than 2% of the Navy by personnel, but accounted for the majority of Japanese shipping losses, and perhaps 55% of overall economic damage inflicted. No other weapon system achieved comparable strategic results with comparable efficiency. The submarines won the war in the Pacific as surely as any army or fleet. Japanese naval officers imprisoned after the war admitted they had been defeated by an enemy they never fully understood. American submarines operated on principles Japanese doctrine didn't account for. With technology, Japanese industry couldn't match. Supported by intelligence Japanese security never suspected was compromised, and backed by industrial production Japanese planning never correctly estimated. The combination was overwhelming. By the time they recognized the threat, it was too late. The merchant marine was already destroyed. Individual survivor accounts from isolated garrisons revealed the blockade's cruelest consequences. Private Yamamoto Kiyoshi, evacuated from New Britain after the war, weighed 83 pounds, down from 140 pounds when his unit deployed. His testimony described the final year of the garrison's existence. We stopped receiving supplies in late 1943. By early 1944, we knew relief wouldn't come. We grew crops, caught fish, but it wasn't enough. Men began dying from starvation and disease. By 1945, we were too weak for military operations. We just waited to die or surrender. The submarines that sank our supply ships killed us as surely as bullets would have. Similar testimonies emerged from garrisons across the Pacific. On islands large and small, Japanese soldiers survived in conditions of desperate hunger, unable to fight, unable to evacuate, abandoned by the empire that had sent them. The submarine blockade created thousands of isolated tragedies, individual garrisons slowly dying while maintaining military discipline and hoping for rescue that never came. These men were victims of strategic warfare, killed by economics rather than explosives. The American submarine force emerged from the war with justified pride in their achievement. They had vindicated submarine warfare as strategic weapon, despite beginning with defective torpedoes and cautious doctrine. They had adapted, innovated, and ultimately dominated their operational environment so thoroughly that Japanese merchant shipping ceased to function as a coherent system. The price of 3,500 submariners lost, while tragic, achieved strategic victory that saved countless American lives by shortening the war. Commander Richard O'Kane, rescued from USS Tang after being sunk by his own torpedo, survived years in Japanese prison camps. Released in 1945, he testified to the effectiveness of submarine warfare from unique perspective, having witnessed Japanese desperation firsthand. From my prison cell, I watched my captors grow increasingly hungry and desperate. By 1945, guards were malnourished, civilian workers were starving, and everyone understood Japan was defeated. The submarine blockade was visible in every Japanese face. We had strangled them economically. Victory was inevitable once that strangulation was complete. The legacy of American submarine warfare in the Pacific extended beyond World War II. The tactics, technology, and doctrine developed during the conflict became foundation for Cold War submarine operations. Nuclear submarines inherited the aggressive doctrine pioneered by commanders like Dealey and Morton. The strategic concept of economic warfare through commerce raiding, validated in the Pacific, became core submarine mission in subsequent conflicts. The lessons learned against Japan shaped American submarine force for generations. For Japan, the submarine disaster led to post-war recognition that island nations cannot sustain themselves without secure sea lanes. Modern Japanese maritime strategy emphasizes anti-submarine warfare as existential priority, directly reflecting World War II experience. Japanese maritime self-defense force devotes extensive resources to anti-submarine warfare capabilities, training against submarine threats with seriousness born from historical catastrophe. The 8 million tons lost are not forgotten. The human cost of submarine warfare, often overlooked in strategic assessments, deserves remembrance. 116,000 Japanese merchant sailors died, higher casualty percentage than any combat service. 250,000 Japanese soldiers died on isolated islands from starvation and disease. 3,500 American submariners went down with their boats. Thousands of Allied POWs died when submarines unknowingly sank transport ships. The total dead from submarine warfare exceeded 500,000, most dying invisibly beneath the waves or slowly from its consequences on remote islands. These deaths purchased strategic victory. By August 1945, Japan's economy was in ruins, her population starving, her military unable to operate, all substantially due to submarine blockade. The atomic bombs ended the war, but submarines had already ensured Japan's defeat. The 8 million tons of shipping lost represented more than statistics. It represented the severing of every connection between Japan's empire and homeland, the starvation of her military and population, and the ultimate vindication of submarine warfare as decisive strategic weapon. Vice Admiral Fukudome Shigeru, Watching the last ships of the merchant marine rust in harbours for lack of fuel or crew in August 1945, finally understood completely what the red pins on his map had meant. Each pin was a ship, a crew, a cargo that never arrived. Collectively, they represented the strangling of Japan's empire, the starvation of her people, and the defeat of her military through economic warfare conducted by submarines most Japanese never saw. The Pacific Ocean, which Japan had thought to dominate, had become her grave through the actions of American submarines that turned every sea lane into killing ground. The war that Japan began with confidence in her navy's supremacy ended with that navy idle in port, without fuel, unable to defend sea lanes that no longer functioned. The submarines that Japanese planners dismissed as manageable threat had destroyed Japan's ability to sustain war through systematic elimination of merchant shipping. The 8 million tons lost told the story of strategic miscalculation that cost an empire its future and hundreds of thousands of people their lives. In the silent depths of the Pacific, American submarines had delivered victory through the mathematics of attrition Japan could never overcome.